In our last discussion, we uncovered how nations, often inadvertently, become ensnared by the relentless grip of excessive debt. Today, we pivot from theory to stark reality, examining the cold, hard numbers that have consistently heralded economic catastrophe. This isn't just history. It's a critical risk assessment, a warning etched in the annals of time for every investor and citizen. These collapses weren't sudden, inexplicable events. They were predictable, their trajectories mapped out in plain sight through escalating debt figures. For those willing to analyze the data, the warning signs were always present, a silent alarm bell ringing louder with each passing year. Understanding these patterns is paramount for safeguarding your financial future. We're not just recounting tales, we're dissecting economic forensics. Each historical example serves as a case study, offering invaluable insights into the mechanisms of currency erosion and the profound risks they pose to wealth and stability. Pay close attention, for these lessons are timeless. Our journey begins with the mighty Roman Empire, a civilization that endured for over a millennium. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero, facing the immense costs of war and the ambitious rebuilding of Rome after a devastating fire, initiated a seemingly minor fiscal adjustment. He reduced the silver content in Roman coinage from 100% to 90%. This provided immediate liquidity, funding his projects and military campaigns. This initial debasement, however, set a dangerous precedent. Subsequent emperors, inheriting mounting debts and continuous military expenditures, found themselves in similar financial straits. Each successive ruler, rather than addressing the root causes of overspending, opted for the path of least resistance, further reducing the precious metal content in their currency. The silver percentage steadily declined, a slow but relentless erosion of monetary value. By 200 AD, Roman coins contained only 50% silver. The public's trust in the currency began to waver, leading to price instability and a growing preference for goods over debased coins. This gradual loss of confidence accelerated the decline. By 270 AD, a mere 200 years after Nero's initial act, Roman coinage was a paltry 5% silver, the rest being cheap, base metals. This wasn't a sudden crash, but a prolonged, insidious debasement. For investors and the general public, this meant a continuous, unacknowledged tax on their wealth. Savings held in Roman currency steadily lost purchasing power, making long-term financial planning a futile exercise. The risk was in the slow, almost imperceptible erosion of value, a silent thief of prosperity. Fast forward to the tumultuous 1790s in France, following the seismic shift of the French Revolution. The new government, having overthrown the monarchy, inherited a nation burdened by colossal debts from years of costly wars. Desperate for funds, they seized vast tracts of church lands, intending to sell them to stabilize the national finances. However, the sales were slow, and the need for immediate capital was urgent. Thus, the assignats were born, paper money initially backed by these seized church lands. In 1790, 400 million assignats were printed, presented as a temporary solution. The initial promise was that these notes would be retired as the land was sold, maintaining their value. But the temptation of easy money proved irresistible. The government, facing ongoing expenses and a lack of tax revenue, continued to print more assignats. The initial backing became increasingly diluted as the volume of paper currency far outstripped the value of the underlying assets. By 1795, an astonishing 40 billion assignats were in circulation, a hundredfold increase in just 5 years. The outcome was predictable and devastating: hyperinflation. Prices skyrocketed daily, rendering the assignats virtually worthless. People resorted to using them as wallpaper, a stark symbol of their complete loss of value. For the general public, this meant their life savings evaporated overnight, leading to widespread poverty and social unrest. Investors holding these government-issued notes saw their capital utterly destroyed. This serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unbacked fiat currency and unchecked government spending. Argentina offers a more contemporary and tragically repetitive lesson in the perils of unsustainable debt. In 1975, the nation's debt-to-GDP ratio was a manageable 9%, a seemingly healthy fiscal position. However, a series of political and economic missteps began to unravel this stability. Military rule, the costly Falklands War, repeated international bailouts, and pervasive corruption fueled a relentless accumulation of debt. By 1989, the consequences were undeniable. Argentina experienced an annual inflation rate of 3,079%. This hyperinflation decimated the purchasing power of its citizens and severely destabilized the economy. Despite various attempts at reform, the debt continued its upward trajectory, reaching an unsustainable 166% of GDP by 2001. The government could no longer service its obligations, leading to a catastrophic default. The default triggered a severe financial crisis. Banks froze accounts, trapping citizens' savings. Widespread riots erupted in the streets as people protested the economic hardship and loss of their life savings. The president was forced to flee by helicopter, a dramatic symbol of the nation's collapse. For investors, this meant significant losses on government bonds and a highly volatile market. For the public, it was a direct assault on their financial security and daily existence. Argentina's repeated defaults underscore the critical risk of sovereign debt and the devastating impact on both domestic and international confidence. Let's turn our analytical lens to the United States, examining its debt trajectory over recent decades. In 1980, the U.S. national debt stood at a relatively modest 32% of GDP, a level generally considered sustainable. By 1990, it had risen to 54% of GDP, still manageable but showing an upward trend. The year 2000 saw it stabilize at 55% of GDP, offering a brief period of fiscal calm. However, the landscape dramatically shifted with the 2008 financial crisis. The government intervened with massive bailouts to stabilize the banking sector, leading to a significant surge in borrowing. By 2010, the debt-to-GDP ratio had climbed to 91%, crossing a critical threshold that economists often associate with increased risk. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 triggered another unprecedented wave of government spending, with trillions borrowed to support the economy. By 2023, the U.S. national debt reached 123% of GDP. This represents a doubling of the debt-to-GDP ratio in just 15 years. While the U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency, this rapid accumulation of debt raises serious questions for investors and the general public. The risk lies in the potential for future inflation, higher interest rates, and a gradual erosion of the dollar's purchasing power. Understanding this trend is crucial for long-term financial planning and portfolio diversification. Zimbabwe provides one of the most extreme and recent examples of currency collapse driven by excessive debt and unchecked money printing. Upon gaining independence in 1980, Zimbabwe boasted a low debt burden and a robust economy. However, political decisions soon began to undermine this stability. The government initiated large payments to war veterans, funding these commitments through borrowing rather than sustainable revenue. Further economic damage occurred with the seizure of white-owned farms, which decimated the agricultural sector, a cornerstone of the economy. Food production collapsed, leading to a sharp decline in government revenues. By 2000, the national debt was spiraling out of control, and the government, unable to collect sufficient taxes, resorted to the desperate measure of printing money to cover its obligations. The consequences were catastrophic. In 2007, Zimbabwe's annual inflation rate hit an astounding 66,000%. This was merely a prelude to the unimaginable. By November 2008, monthly inflation reached an astronomical 79.6 billion%, meaning prices doubled approximately every 24 hours. The national currency became utterly worthless, rendering savings, wages, and investments meaningless. For the general public, daily life became an impossible struggle, with basic necessities becoming unaffordable. Investors witnessed the complete annihilation of any assets denominated in the local currency. By 2009, Zimbabwe officially abandoned its own currency, adopting the US dollar and other foreign currencies. This serves as a stark, undeniable warning of the ultimate risk when governments lose control of their fiscal and monetary policies. What do these disparate historical examples, from ancient Rome to modern Zimbabwe, have in common. A chillingly consistent pattern emerges. In each case, the national debt began to grow slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Then, fueled by political expediency, economic shocks, or unsustainable policies, the pace accelerated. Eventually, it exploded, reaching levels that defied economic logic. Each government, convinced of its unique circumstances, believed it could manage the situation. They thought they could borrow just a little more, or that economic growth would magically resolve the problem. They were all profoundly mistaken. The belief that one can indefinitely outgrow an ever-increasing debt burden is a dangerous delusion, a critical risk factor for any economy. Economists closely monitor a key metric, the debt-to-GDP ratio. Historical analysis reveals a critical threshold. When this ratio consistently exceeds 90%, economies often begin to experience significant headwinds and increased instability. The risk of financial distress escalates dramatically. When it surpasses 130%, the likelihood of a full-blown currency crisis or sovereign default becomes alarmingly high. These are not arbitrary numbers. They are historical indicators of impending danger. Consider Japan, which currently holds the unenviable distinction of having the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in the developed world, exceeding 260%. How does a nation sustain such an extraordinary level of debt without immediate collapse? Japan's unique situation is maintained through a delicate balancing act. Its central bank keeps interest rates near zero, effectively making the cost of borrowing incredibly cheap. Furthermore, the Bank of Japan actively purchases vast quantities of government bonds, essentially monetizing a significant portion of the national debt. However, this strategy, while effective in the short term, cannot defy economic gravity indefinitely. It creates a fragile system, highly susceptible to any shift in market confidence or interest rate expectations. For investors, this presents a complex risk profile. While the yen has remained relatively stable, the long-term implications of such massive debt and unconventional monetary policy are uncertain. The potential for a sudden loss of confidence or an inflationary spiral remains a significant, albeit latent, risk. Greece offers a more recent and painful illustration of what happens when a nation's debt becomes unmanageable within a larger economic bloc. In 2010, Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio soared to 146%, far exceeding the sustainability threshold. Unable to service its debts, Greece faced imminent default, threatening the stability of the entire Eurozone. The European Union and the International Monetary Fund were forced to intervene with massive bailout packages. However, these bailouts came with stringent conditions. Greece was compelled to implement severe austerity measures, deep cuts to pensions, significant reductions in government jobs, and substantial tax increases. Banks were forced to freeze accounts, causing immense hardship for ordinary citizens. The experience was economically and socially devastating, a stark reminder of the brutal consequences of fiscal irresponsibility. For investors, it highlighted the risks of sovereign debt even within a seemingly stable currency union. The overarching lesson from these historical narratives is clear and unequivocal. Excessive debt does not trigger an immediate currency collapse. It's a process, often unfolding over years, sometimes even decades. But once the debt-to-GDP ratio crosses critical thresholds, a clock begins ticking. The timeline may vary. Rome's debasement took 200 years, France's hyperinflation just 5, Argentina's multiple cycles, and Zimbabwe's about 20 years, but the underlying pattern remains constant. High, unsustainable debt inevitably leads governments to resort to printing money, either directly or indirectly through central bank actions. This expansion of the money supply, without a corresponding increase in productive output, invariably leads to inflation. And unchecked inflation, if allowed to spiral, ultimately culminates in the collapse of a currency's purchasing power and public trust. This is the fundamental risk assessment framework derived from centuries of economic history. This deep dive into historical debt numbers constitutes stage 1 of our analysis. It's about recognizing the early warning signs, understanding the mechanisms of currency erosion, and assessing the inherent risks. These patterns are not mere historical curiosities. They are vital indicators for navigating our present and future economic landscapes. In our next video, we will move to stage 2, where the narrative takes an even more intriguing turn. Because in stage 2, even as the debt continues to mount, everything often feels incredibly prosperous. Life seems so good that many believe the party will never end, ignoring the gathering storm clouds. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss stage 2. Understanding these historical patterns isn't about succumbing to fear. It's about empowering yourself with knowledge. For investors, this means critically evaluating asset allocation, considering inflation hedges, and diversifying across geographies and asset classes. For the general public, it means understanding the value of sound money, protecting your savings, and advocating for fiscal responsibility. In uncertain times, informed decision-making is your most valuable asset. Equip yourself with this knowledge, analyze the risks, and take proactive steps to protect your financial future.